Test is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. We'll be getting started here shortly. We're going to wait. There's still a lot of people jumping on, so we're going to give them a couple of more minutes for others who are jumping on. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks, everybody, for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend our webinar on what your dealerships must have in compliance today for red flag, adverse, and risk-based pricing. Okay, the first thing that we want to state is that we're going to discuss the topics today, but most of the information in the webinar is educational purposes and should not be construed as legal advice. As always, we always encourage everyone to consult with your outside counsel in determining the appropriate course of action for your organization. Some of the things we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about the red flag program, risk-based pricing notices and adverse action notices, and then at the end of the webinar, we're opening up for questions and answers. And you can ask your questions by going to the questions section. That's part of the go-to program on the right, and you can just type your question in there, and we'll address those at the end of the webinar. So to always start these types of webinars, I'd like to touch on what's behind, what's the reasoning or the logic behind some of the laws that we're reviewing today. The red flag regulations was put in place by the government to help fight identity theft. When identity theft was on the rise, and they wanted to ensure that everyone applying for credit is who they said they were, and that also the consumers were more educated on what's occurring within their credit files. We have risk-based pricing notice, again, to make consumers aware of their credit rating, ensure that consumers are aware of the impact of their payments, their payment history has on their credit file, ensure that the information in their credit file is their own, is accurate, and again, part of that identity theft to make sure consumers are monitoring their credit file. Adverse action was originally part of the original FCRA, and that the consumer should be aware that a decision was made based on negative information in on their credit file. So we're going to start with the red flag program. And why are we starting with red flag first? Because within this regulation, the government was very specific on what they expect dealers to have in place. And they have also discussed that they expect the same types of items in place for the other policies. regarding risk-based pricing, adverse action, and even policies that we're not going to focus on today, but we'll mention at the end. But your red flag, again, is a program that is put in place to help identify red flags. And dealerships are required, some of the things that they stipulated in the regulation, that you must have a written policy in place. They refer to it as an identity theft protection policy, an ITPP. And some of the things that it also states is that you have to have a training component, so you have to ensure that your users are trained, and as you have turnover within your employees, those must also be trained. You have to have a monitoring component of your red flag program, a reporting component, and an audit component. And it also states that you must have a compliance officer. That's something that's going to be a recurring theme that you're also going to hear as a big takeaway is to find a compliance officer. And a piece of that reporting component is that the compliance officer must be reporting to senior management on the status of their compliance programs. So one of the components is identifying red flags. So how do what must your red flag program have in place? It has to have in place, and this is right out of the regulation, that it must have an OFAC database search. I think that was sort of a carryover. There was OFAC laws and regulations in place previous to this regulation, but they included it in this regulation. You must also have an address verification against the public record database, so you're verifying that the applicant's address is accurate. You must also do a fraud database check. There's many databases, and they're growing, that contain information such as mail drops, prisons, known fraudulent activity in the past. It must also include master death file, social security number validation as part of the fraud database. Also a manual ID verification, really that's the ID verification component, so you're verifying the ID that is being presented to you at the point of purchase. What happens when you do have a red flag or an address discrepancy? You have to have a process defined in place to remediate that. The most common red flags are address discrepancies because of how databases are updated. A person can move and the database might not be updated for 60 to 90 days based on how the information in that database is captured. There are manual methods that you can utilize if an address discrepancy exists, or if there's a red flag, because again, the purpose of the red flag is to verify the person that's sitting in front of you is who they say they are, or is who they've written down on that application. And some of the manual methods are similar to those that when you might encounter when you go to renew your driver's license or get a new driver's license, change your address. Additional forms of identification, utility bills that verify the address. The problem with these methods is that typically a consumer doesn't come to your dealership with these methods of address verification. So they have to leave, and we don't like that. So what we recommend and what you will see in a good red flag program are out-of-wallet questions. And those are questions that you can ask the consumer that only they will know the answer to. And we'll see an example of those later in the presentation. But they're based on public record databases, things like previous addresses and they're typically multiple choice. You have lived at one of the following 4 addresses in the past 5 years, or you own that the regulation stresses is ID verification. And what this calls for, and they're very specific about what the regulation calls for, the applicant must provide a form of government ID. The ID must appear unaltered, and the image and physical description must be consistent with the applicant. Meaning, if it says, the ID says he's 6'4", and the person sitting in front of you is 5'4", there's an issue. And the ID also must match the application that's in front of you. problem is that, one of the issues that our dealers face is that how do you audit this? How do you report on this? How do you show that you've done this? Some methods that we've seen are little checklists that are placed in the deal jacket by the dealer that they've done these 4 specific things. Within our system, we give the dealers the ability to check a box and it records who checked it, the date and time they checked it, the IP address they checked it, and then it's automatically attached to the application. So what's at stake here if you don't comply, you're audited, and you don't have a red flag program in place? The fines can be $3,500 per occurrence. So if you have no program in place, it doesn't take long to do the math to see that this could be an extreme fine and could really hurt your dealership. And if an auditor does show up at your dealership, not having a program in place or not knowing, stating you're not aware is no longer an acceptable policy. They're going to be pretty harsh on you. And as with all these policies, as long as you have a policy in place, and that you're trying to execute the program and the policy that you have in place, they're going to tend to be more lenient if they find some gaps in your policy, and they'll give you a chance to remediate them before they come down hard on you. So again, the recurring recommendation here is, get a compliance officer defined, ensure he understands the programs and the policies that are being required of the dealership, and that he's working towards putting these policies in place. Some of the things that you might must have in place, and again, there's a little bit of recurring theme here as we go through the different policies. You must have a defined policy and procedure in place. In the red flag, they stipulate an ITPP, but you also must have policies in place for your other components, such as adverse action and risk-based pricing. The policy must define how you're performing red flags on each of your applicants, how you're remediating those, and then how you're reporting and monitoring the progress of those, and then also how you're going to audit it on a monthly basis. So those are critical components. And then at the end, you have to ask yourself, does this cover 100% of the applicants that come through the dealership? It must. And one of the recommendations that we also make is to look at the systems. I've been in some dealerships where they're pulling credit reports in the CRM over here, DMS over here, maybe they're using an online portal over here. So if you're defining policies and you're pulling credit in 3 different systems, that's a problem, because now I have to define policies and procedures for each of those systems. I have to have audits in place for each of those systems, reporting, monitoring. It really complicates things. So you really need to look at streamlining your processes within the dealership and trying to consolidate where you're pulling credit reports, and so that you can consolidate your compliance program, how you're doing compliance, how you're monitoring compliance. If you're pulling in 3 different systems, there might be 3 different systems, or 3 different red flag programs, 3 different risk-based pricing programs. So monitoring and maintaining 3 different systems really becomes complex. And these other components now we discussed, how do you monitor, how do you audit, how do you report? Typically, the policies that we're discussing today, they come associated with your credit reporting provider. So, if you're not aware of how your credit reporting provider proposes you satisfy these regulations, you need to become aware of that, ask the questions. You don't get the right answers, you need to look at changing providers. But some things that you might want to look for is, as I mentioned earlier, electronic logging, so that reporting and auditing becomes easier. So rather than doing manual reporting, you can do system-generated reports and monitor. You can monitor through systems interfaces. You want to record when a red flag occurs and how it was remediated. And you want to have reporting that can also be audited and makes auditing easy. You also want to look, if you don't have an identity theft protection policy in place today, look for your system provider to see if they provide one. And with the red flag, you also want to look for that out-of-wallet solution. Not only is it an effective method, it's also, it keeps that consumer from having to leave the dealership, and it eliminates that gaps in your policy. If you don't resolve those red flags, that could be a finable offense. So I'm going to give you some samples of our product so that you can see what a red flag product might look like and how out-of-wallet questions might be integrated. Here you can see our red flag product that's run on every credit request. You can see the credit report at the bottom, and it does appear at the top of the credit report. On the left here, it highlights the 4 key sections: the OFAC, the ID match, and the red flag fraudulent database alerts. We also have a confidence score up at the right, that how confident are we that this consumer is who they say they are. And if it approaches the yellow or red area, it will require out-of-wallet questions that are integrated into the system. Here you can also see there was an address discrepancy on the address that was on the application. So we provide the feature to run out-of-wallet questions to remediate and remove that alert. We also have a manual ID verification section here where I can click verify the ID, and it will run you through those questions. You can select them, and it will record it. And that's the important piece, that we're recording this electronically, and you have electronic auditing and reporting. We also have our dashboard. Many credit report providers today have some type of dashboard that allows you to monitor your program to ensure that these policies and procedures are being enacted within your dealership. We do have a red flag monitor section that's specific for a red flag program. And you can see here that it summarizes what's taken place to date. There was 129 applicants. There were 114 alerts. This could be a subprime or dealership. But you can see here that this dealership, they're not using auto-wallet, so they haven't resolved these either manually or automatically. So they have to use manual means to resolve the red flag alerts, or they can use the auto-wallet questions to resolve. And by clicking on this 114 here in the red, I can see, again, the auditing and reporting component. I can see who I didn't resolve these for. And if I sold a car to one of these, I need to remediate that immediately. We're also monitoring, as the regulation states, fraud victim and security alerts. If a consumer states their identity has been stolen, that's part of that fraud alert check. Active duty alerts. If someone has that they're in the active duty and that shows up on their credit file, we have to make sure that we're validating that person is who they say they are in front of us. There's been a high, we see a lot of people trying to steal the identity of people that are overseas serving our country, which is unfortunate. And again, here's the manual verification. Did we verify the identity, the ID of the applicants as they come here? You can see that this example, this dealer is not using our electronic means to verify, so hopefully they have a manual means. That's it for the red flag section. If you have any questions on that, be sure to note those. We'll be happy to address those at the end. We're going to talk about risk-based pricing notices. Now a little bit of the history of the notices, how this regulation came into place. What is risk-based pricing? At a very high level, it's when you're running someone's credit, you're going to vary their interest rate based on their score or other factors in their credit report. So that's risk-based pricing. Their interest rate is going to vary based on the quality of their credit file. The official definition here is that you offer credit on material terms that are materially less favorable than your most favorable material terms available to a substantial portion of your credit customers. And we're going to talk about some of the confusion that occurred when this regulation first came came out, and you can see by the definition that it's not easily understandable. So some of the confusion that we see when talking to dealerships is, do I need to provide a risk-based pricing notice to everyone or just some of my customers? Well, the original regulations stated just a substantial portion of your customers, and that that substantial proportion was left up to the dealerships to calculate. And that, right away became apparent it was going to be difficult for dealerships to determine what is a substantial portion. One important note here is this regulation does refer to dealers as arrangers of credit and a participating creditor. And they were very careful to include this because this sort of ties in the dealership to adverse action and the dealership's responsibilities under adverse action. So they actually defined how to calculate a substantial proportion when they came out with the original regulation. And they gave you three methods: a credit score proxy method, a tiered pricing method if you have tiers in your pricing models, a direct comparison method. But basically, you had to do a calculation that determined, the 60% of your applicants, where they fell below an average score within your dealership. That was determined the easiest method. Calculate what's your average score, where does 60% of my applicants fall in that score range. So they realized that this was difficult to maintain, so they came out with the exception notice, right? Because not only do you have to calculate it once, you have to regularly monitor it and then regularly calculate it, which is not easy. So what they said, okay, here's an exception notice. In the amendment that came out, they even gave an example of the exception notice that you must use. And they said, okay, you can use this notice, but you just have to give it to everyone. So if that's where the confusion is. The original regulation stated you didn't have to give it to everyone, but if you warrant, you got to calculate it. But the exception notice says you got to give it to everyone, and you must give it to them before they sign the financial contract. So 99.9% of our dealers use the exception notice to deliver it to everyone because it's an easy policy to put in place, report on, and monitor. And I actually don't know of anyone that's using the original method. So some of the advantages of the exception notice, again, you don't need to determine who gets it. It gives a score. It tells the consumer what their score was. And it also tells them the scorecard used, the bureau used. So there's a lot of advantages of the exception notice. But again, you must deliver it as soon as possible after you obtain the consumer's credit score, but in all cases before the financial transaction is consummated. Some more items that are included in the exception notice: the range of the possible scores, graphical representation of where that consumer ranks nationally, educational information relative to scores. It tells them where they can get a free copy of their credit report annually. It also gives them contact information for the credit bureaus in case they want to dispute any information. So it really is an educational piece. It's not like an adverse action sort of has a negative tone to it. This doesn't. It has a very positive tone, and it educates consumers. And for that reason, even though some of this seems burdensome to the dealership, I feel it's a positive impact on the industry because educating consumers on their scores, how to look, ensure that the information is accurate, the impact their payment history has on their score, I think is driving up the average score, and which in turn is going to drive up consumer buying power. What's in stake? What's at stake if you don't have a risk-based pricing policy in place? Again, the fines are heavy. It's per incident, again, $3,500, and this one can be part in a civil suit. And we don't want civil suits because now you have lawyers possibly out there specializing in this, looking for dealerships not compliant, and then asking to reach out to everyone that's purchased a car from you over the last year for the purposes of participating in the civils. Again, we talked about a redundant message here. What must your dealership have in place? Policies. You must have a defined policy, how your dealership has a risk-based pricing notice policy in place, how it ensures that everyone is receiving a copy. Again, it's got to entail all the systems you're pulling credit from, how it's going to be generated, and at the end, you got to ask again, will 100% of my applicants receive a copy of the notice? And reporting, auditing, all has to be included in your policy. So again, features to look for in your credit reporting solution: know where the risk-based pricing notice is available to your users who are pulling credit. If your credit provider is not providing risk-based pricing notices, you need to address that immediately. One of the things, again, that we're looking for in a policy is automation. Right? You don't want to be reliant on manual practices, because manual practices are hard to audit, hard to report on. So when you're defining your policy, see how you can eliminate those manual practices. And our best practice that we recommend to dealers is to use, and we're going to talk about this, features to look for in credit, automated, a way to automatically mail a notice to a consumer. So put a policy in place that states that when the consumer is in your finance office, you're printing the risk-based pricing notice, you're printing 2 copies, you're asking them to sign one, you give them one, they're signing that they've received it, put a copy of that in your deal jacket. Anybody that doesn't make it to the finance office will be automatically mailed a risk-based pricing notice. So now I have an audit report that shows who made it to the finance office, who I printed these for, and that who were mailed. That can be electronically audited, reported on, and it's a very good policy so that you can rest assured that every applicant that comes in your, or that you pull a credit report on, not necessarily comes into your dealership. That's why this policy fills that gap. Is going to receive that notice. Online applicants, maybe that you pulled a report on, maybe an applicant that you had email correspondence with, or someone that came in, you pulled a credit report on, but they left before they made it to the finance office. This policy ensures everyone will receive it. So we're going to show you a little bit of what our system offers. Here you can see an example of a risk-based pricing notice. It has the score, the bureau, the scorecard name. Here's that range I mentioned earlier. It shows where the applicant sits in terms of the rest of the country with this score. Again, as a monitoring tool, we have our risk-based pricing program monitor within our dashboard. It's going to tell us how many of these applicants are queued to be mailed by the mailhouse, and how many notices are scheduled or have been delivered. This number must also always be 100%. 100% of the applicants must receive a notice. So this is an easy program. If you have the right policy in place, it becomes a real easy program to monitor and audit. With our system, anytime it's printed, it comes out of this bucket queued to be mailed and goes into the printed locally bucket. And then we also monitor this number here, which is what you really want to look out for, is applicants with no notice delivered or viewed. And that would be anyone, if they didn't have that mailhouse behind it, they would fall into this bucket. That ends the risk-based pricing section. I'm going to try and get through the adverse action notice section as quickly as I can here. We're approaching half-hour mark. If you have questions on the risk-based pricing program, please note those on the right. This also is one of the most confusing policies, has the most wide variety of opinions. So we're going to speak to our opinion. I've been in the credit industry for 20-something years, and so I've been familiar with this policy since I came into the industry. And initially, and many years ago, the dealerships send adverse action notices by lenders. Well, that's not an acceptable policy. The only circumstance where that might be considered an acceptable policy, if you're, as every consumer that walks into your store, you send to the same funding source, and you're pulling credit within that funding source's system, or they're providing a credit report. But you can only send applicants to that funding source. If you're using more than one funding source, you need to be sending adverse action notices. And we'll talk more about why that is as we go through here. Again, you have to remember that the government considers dealerships an arranger of credit, and an arranger of credit has adverse action responsibilities. You are participators in the credit decision. If you look, you'll see that language in the original We encourage, when you're looking to put a policy in place, remember that's part of the redundant message here, is get a policy in place. Get multiple opinions. Your state associations have opinions. Your national associations, NADA, they have opinions on the adverse action program that you must have in place. Obtain one of those and adopt it as your own and ensure that you put it in place. Again, it's, if you are audited, if you have a policy, even if it doesn't align with what the auditor feels you should be doing, but you have a policy in place and you are delivering adverse action in certain situations, they're going to be much more lenient and explain why you need to audit or broaden your policy. And, they might say, well, I got to come back to make sure you're doing this, but that's better than being fined. Again, penalties are steep, and it's each violation. So the confusion is, where does adverse action take place, and who do I have to deliver adverse action notices to? I've seen a lot of presentations where they really don't dive in. They talk about adverse action, say that you need to have it in place, but they really don't talk about where it occurs in the dealership. I've seen some presentations that say, just leave it up to your lender, which is really aggravating because that's not the message we want out in our industry. It's not the message that we want dealers adhering to. If the government starts auditing and finds that no dealerships have adverse action programs, they're really going to step up their fines and their audits. And when they come into our dealerships, we want to ensure that, hey, this is an industry that has this piece under control. We support all dealerships' policies. We'll offer our best practice suggestions, but we support whatever their policy is. And again, here, we're going to recommend that you automate it as much as possible so that you're not you don't have manual processes in your policy, because that means manual processes can be overlooked, can be forgotten, somebody's not in someday, somebody doesn't audit the report. So if you're audited, you could come in and they could see, again, where you have gaps in your policy. So some of the things that we see some dealerships want to deliver a notice for everyone that comes in that they pull a credit report but don't sell a car to. We feel that this will cover you, but it's probably a little bit, you're sending adverse action notices to people that you don't need to send them to, those in those high score ranges. Another policy is every customer obtains a credit report and is declined by the dealer. That, I think, everybody could agree to, that is adverse action. A consumer comes in, you pull their credit report, and you don't submit them to any lender. You don't have a subprime, a bottom of the subprime range, and you just say, I don't have a program for you. I don't have someone that will allow you to buy a car. That's adverse action. Clearly, there's not a lender involved. You pulled that person's credit. You made a decision based on your review of the credit that person would not qualify for a loan. So they need to receive a notice from your dealership. Now, this policy has to be part of your existing policy, but It's not encompassing of all the instances where adverse action occurs. This needs to be part of it, part of your policy, part of your program, but it's not all encompassing. Every customer for whom the dealer obtains a credit report below a certain cutoff, the theory here is, and it's a good theory, but again, it's not all encompassing, that my primary lender, I need to send an adverse action letter to my everybody I don't send to my primary lender because they fell below score cutoff, so I didn't submit them to my primary lender. So therefore, I made a decision based on reviewing their credit to send them to a lender where terms may have not been as favorable as my primary lender. That is adverse action, but again, it's not an all-encompassing policy. So let's look at some language out of the regulation of where adverse occurs. This first one here is what we just talked about. A dealer takes a credit application from a customer to finance the sale of a vehicle. They cannot find a buyer for the installment sales contract, and they are unable to offer financing to the customer. Absolutely, we just discussed that. I think we can all agree that's adverse. The second one is where the confusion lies. The customer applies for credit on certain terms. The dealership offers the deal on different terms, and the customer rejects their counteroffer. So that term, the counteroffer, and how counteroffer is defined in this sentence is really where your dealership has to have adverse action. So let's say you're advertising a zero interest rate loan program. The consumer walks in, you pull their credit. You're not even going to submit them to that loan program because they didn't qualify. You can tell they're not going to qualify. So you make them a counteroffer by submitting their application to a different lender with an interest rate. That's the counteroffer. Did they accept the counteroffer? If they buy a car, you do not need to send them an adverse action notice. If they do not buy the car, that means they didn't accept the counteroffer, and you need to send them the adverse action notice. So these are the two policies that your adverse action program must incorporate. And we work with dealers all the time in automating this for them. And we're elaborating here on when that counteroffer occurs. And note here that you can determine that by a score cutoff. You know what the minimum score your primary lender is going to accept for their program. So anybody that declines that counteroffer, falls below that score cutoff, and doesn't buy a car should be identified and sent a letter. And so this can be automated, and we automate this for dealerships all the time, and you should look to automate it, again, eliminating manual processes. So if you can define what your score cutoff is for your primary loan program, and then upload to your credit provider a list of consumers who you sold the car to, you can then automatically send letters to anyone that fell below that score cutoff and did not buy a car. That's the two pieces of information you need to have a complete program in place. So now that we understand where adverse occurs and who should get an adverse action letter, let's look again at the program. And again, charge your compliance officer to define how your program and policy will be in place at your dealership. If it includes an opinion letter, include the opinion or the white paper or policy from your state association in your program policy, so that if you are audited, they can see that you did some due diligence on the policy that you felt you should have in place. Again, you have to outline the systems where you're pulling credit, and how you're determining within each of those systems where adverse action occurs. So again, you can see the benefit of consolidating where you're pulling credit. And again, how are you monitoring, how are you auditing, and how are you reporting? And that systems automation piece is real important. Again, things to look for from where you are purchasing your credit. Make sure that a letter can be generated. You know where to generate that adverse. There's also been some changes in the adverse regulations within the last year that you must also include the score in your adverse action letter. The reason codes that come back with that scorecard must be in there, and also information on the scorecard, the scorecard that was used, the actual name. So other things to look for in your system is if they can track what notices were printed, and again, you can have a policy where you're printing notices in the dealership and track that electronically. That really helps the automation and the reporting. Here's an example of an adverse action notice, and you can see here it's generated up top, available next to the credit reports, risk-based pricing notice. This one shows an example of co-applicants. Remember these things that all the policies that we talked about, co-applicants must be included in these policies. And again, we have our dashboard here to help the dealerships monitor, and we're looking at the applicants' letters that were mailed, and you can view the applicants who did receive a letter, who didn't receive a letter, and compare that to your list of autos sold. Okay, quickly here, other policies to be aware of, and these are other policies that we're seeing being enforced. Privacy policy, you must hand every consumer, deliver to every consumer a privacy notice of what you're going to do with their information, what you're not going to use their information for, so you're disclosing it to the consumer. You must have security policies in place around your technology and your infrastructure systems, and be training your employees on. So, do you have timeouts on your monitors? And when you resume, do they require a login? What are your password policies? When do they expire? Everybody has to have a unique user ID and password. Those are the type of policies. There's a large venue of sources out on the internet where you can get security policies to implement within your dealership. But again, I would get that compliance officer, start researching these policies, work with the person in charge of your IT to ensure that you have them in place. And we've also seen policies being implemented where you're surveying your vendors, your service providers. What systems are you using? Do they have policies in place that are safeguarding your information? So if you're using a third-party system to pull credit or to capture consumer information, that's sensitive consumer date of birth, social security number, the systems that are capturing that information have to be compliant, have to have these safeguards in place. And we're also data breach. We're seeing data breaches on the rise. Hackers are hacking into systems like DealerTrack, Route 1, they're hacking into your dealership's information. You're responsible for that. We're coming out with a data breach program that will have insurance to help protect you of the costs in the case that you do have a data breach, and then a response plan. You have to have a response plan in place. If there is a data breach, how are you informing consumers, and how are you helping consumers secure their identity? So just to recap here, and then we'll open up to questions and answers. Again, what are the big takeaways from today? First, hopefully, from what you've learned today, you've come to the understanding that you have to take action. You cannot continue to do anything because of the fines, because audits are starting to occur. So hopefully you're going to agree to take action. Appoint a compliance officer to assess what you have in place, assess what's available to your dealership today. Consider consolidating your sources of credit when you're putting your policies in place. Make sure you have written policies for these items. Get them in place and stay compliant. It's inexpensive to be compliant. It might look to be expensive or additional cost to your transactional and to have overhead to monitor this. It might seem like it's an additional cost, but it's very inexpensive to be out of compliance and have an audit occur. So we're going to go ahead and open it to questions and answers. If you have a question, please feel free to enter it on the right. We have our first question. Can these be printed off? I'm not sure what you're referring to. If you're referring to the risk-based pricing notices, the adverse action notices, they can be printed off. The problem with a total policy with just printing them off, I would recommend if you are going to print them off to print off 2 copies, does this cover 100% of your applicants printing them off and delivering to the consumers? I think you'll find that it doesn't. It still leaves a gap. You have to audit it. If you are going to print them off, make sure your system provider tells you who you printed them off for and who you didn't. If my policy is to print them off and put them in the deal jacket, how do I account for people I pull credit on that I don't have a deal jacket for? Where am I storing those that I didn't have a deal jacket for? So it presents some challenges when it comes time to audit and report on how your program is doing. If you're to audit that, you really need to be auditing your deal jackets. I'm not sure. You don't want to have to audit every one of your deal jackets. Do you want to do a random audit? When you have an automated process in place on deal jackets, that's much less. Okay. Next question here. We are a finance company, but we do not pull credit. We use the credit reports from the dealerships. Would this letter apply to us as well, or only for those who pull credit? If you are a finance company and you're using the dealership's credit report, you are in violation of the FCRA. I promise I won't disclose your name and the dealership who posed that question or the finance company who posed that question. The way to look at reusing multiple credit reports is that every time someone looks at a consumer's credit report, the FCRA states that an inquiry must be placed on that consumer's file so they're notified that that institution looked at their credit report. You cannot share credit reports between dealerships and finance institutions. There are some finance institutions out there that pull credit reports and offer their dealerships free access to them. My opinion is that's a violation of the FCRA because multiple people are making credit decisions on viewing that file. Next question. Why mail RPN if it's signed by the customer before signing financial paperwork? Shouldn't copy be provided to the customer at that time? If I wasn't clear, but that is our best policy, best practice is to present that to the consumer at the signing ceremony and to retain a copy and to mail to everyone that doesn't make it to that signing ceremony. In other words, you didn't print. Now, we do recommend to some dealerships to mail to all, which I think answers your question. The reason sometimes we recommend that to dealerships is that it makes auditing easier. If it's a dealership that might not have a compliance officer in place or doesn't have good program policies, if you just mail to everyone, you're in compliance. However, you still have to present that to the consumer prior to the signing, and you have to show that. So for auditing purposes, it might make things easier to mail to all, but you still have to be presenting it in the finance office prior to the signing ceremony. Can I receive a hard copy of the webinar? Yes, you can. If you email our support desk, they'll be happy to mail you a copy, support@700credit.com. They've already been given a copy. How does the identity verification methods section apply to customers to submit applications online? If there is a red flag, is there a process that we can use to rectify red flags for these customers? First piece, the ID verification. You have to verify that person is who they say they are before you deliver the car. So at some point, you need to be verifying their identity. And whether it's a notarized copy of their driver's license, I'm not sure of the acceptable methods there, but you have to verify their identity. If there is a red flag, you can run red flag on online applications, right? Because they're database validations, they're database checks. And if there is a red flag, you can deliver the out-of-wallet questions over the phone. You can ask the questions and select the answer that the user provides or the consumer provides. We see some dealerships ask and they populate the answers based on the consumer's response. We see some dealerships turn the monitor around and ask them for their answers. We see some dealerships print off a copy and have them populate it. So there are various methods that you can do. When is printed federal notices free and when do we get charged? We don't charge our dealerships for printing notices and delivering to consumers. We charge for the mail house. It's a fairly reasonable price, considering it includes postage, printing, stuffing of the envelope. I think our retail price is $1.05. Again, we can automate that, and we tie it into an automated solution. If we are already using 700 credit, do we need to worry about any of these issues? Yeah, you do. We provide the tools. You need to be ensured that your dealerships have policies in place that utilize the tools. So you still need to have policies in place. The policies that we provide our dealerships, include the usage of our systems. So they're encompassing, they talk to how items are going to be satisfied and fulfilled. But you have to have these policies in place. You have to be auditing, right? You have to be monitoring, and you have to be reporting. So you have to have a compliance office, compliance manager that's utilizing the tools. How does all this work with online applications? Online applications doesn't alleviate you from the requirements of the regulations. If, let's say, and we offer an online application, finance application that dealers can post on their websites that feed our systems. It can feed a pre-screen soft pull product. It can feed a credit pull. And it can be, the red flag piece can be automated. The database check can be done, and you can generate the out-of-wallet questions to ask the consumer over the phone in an online scenario. The risk-based pricing notice, you still have to deliver to the consumer. You can email a risk-based pricing notice to the consumer. I probably should have mentioned that's part of the program. You can, and that will be tracked. The notice is emailed to the consumer in an online environment. Adverse action notice. So that's the one that you really want to be careful of. You still have to deliver adverse action notices for online applications. And again, that's why tying that and automating that mail house is so important. If you don't print and deliver that adverse action notice, we have dealerships that print them for free and mail them themselves. But again, that ties into the auditing component and reporting. Our mail house ties into all our electronic monitoring and auditing and reporting so that we record when we mail it. You can see that it was mailed by the U.S. Post Office. But you still have to deliver that adverse action notice when it occurs. Can the information, the PowerPoint, again, we can send it to you. You can print it if you like. Again, support at 700credit.com. Can you print a score disclosure exception notice from 700 Credit? Yes, you can. There's print buttons within the screens. Can I use the system within my CRM, or do you have a dealer portal? We pull credit within Route 1 today. The for those who might not be aware, we are integrated into most third-party systems, probably the largest integration partner out there. We integrate with all the major providers, and DealerClick, Vin Solutions, Dealer Socket, for instance. All these products and services are available within those solutions. So if you use those and would like to pull credit within those systems and satisfy your compliance, the dashboard's available within those systems. The notices are available within those systems. We're also Route 1. We are a credit provider within Route 1. We can deliver notices, red flag within Route 1. Some of the automation tools aren't available within Route 1. Route 1 also has a very comprehensive compliance solution. So why do customers get adverse action letters if they have been approved but are waiting for a vehicle to come in for longer than 30 days? That's 30 days. After 30 days, you start to fall outside the window of a timely matter. We have some of our automation solutions automate and mail notices for everyone who qualifies 15 to 20 days after the credit was pulled, which we feel is a timely manner. And some of the regulations state within the time. You can, within our systems, you can unselect applicants who might be waiting for that delivery of the vehicle to not receive that.